Section 34 of The Interpretation of Dreams. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Cynthia Moyer. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. Translated by A. Brill. Section 34. Absurd Dreams, Intellectual Performances in Dreams. Part 1. Hitherto, in our interpretation of dreams, we have come upon the element of absurdity in the dream content so frequently that we must no longer postpone the investigation of its cause and its meaning. We remember, of course, that the absurdity of dreams has furnished the opponents of dream interpretation with their chief argument for regarding the dream as merely the meaningless product of an attenuated and fragmentary activity of the psyche. I will begin with a few examples in which the absurdity of the dream content is apparent only, disappearing when the dream is more thoroughly examined. These are certain dreams which, accidentally, one begins by thinking are concerned with the dreamer's dead father. 1. Here is the dream of a patient who had lost his father 6 years before the date of the dream. His father had been involved in a terrible accident. He was traveling by the night express when the train was derailed, the seats were telescoped, and his head was crushed from side to side. The dreamer sees him lying on his bed. From his left eyebrow a wound runs vertically upwards. The dreamer is surprised that his father should have met with an accident, since he is dead already, as the dreamer adds in relating his dream. His father's eyes are so clear. According to the prevailing standards of dream criticism, this dream content would be explained as follows. At first, while the dreamer is picturing his father's accident, he has forgotten that his father has already been many years in his grave. In the course of the dream, this memory awakens, so that he is surprised at his own dream even while he is dreaming it. Analysis, however, tells us that it is quite superfluous to seek for such explanations. The dreamer had commissioned a sculptor to make a bust of his father, and he had inspected the bust 2 days before the dream. It is this which seems to him to have come to grief. The German word means gone wrong or met with an accident. The sculptor has never seen his father, and has had to work from photographs. On the very day before the dream, the son had sent an old family servant to the studio in order to see whether he, too, would pass the same judgment upon the marble bust, namely, that it was too narrow between the temples. And now follows the memory material which has contributed to the formation of the dream. The dreamer's father had a habit, whenever he was harassed by business cares or domestic difficulties, of pressing his temples between his hands, as though his head was growing too large and he was trying to compress it. When the dreamer was 4 years old, he was present when a pistol was accidentally discharged and his father's eyes were blackened. His eyes are so clear. When his father was thoughtful or depressed, he had a deep furrow in his forehead just where the dream shows his wound. The fact that in the dream this wrinkle is replaced by a wound points to the second occasion for the dream. The dreamer had taken a photograph of his little daughter. The plate had fallen from his hand, and when he picked it up, it revealed a crack which ran like a vertical furrow across the child's forehead, extending as far as the eyebrow. He could not help feeling a superstitious foreboding, for on the day before his mother's death the negative of her portrait had been cracked. Thus the absurdity of this dream is simply the result of a carelessness of verbal expression, which does not distinguish between the bust or the photograph and the original. We are all accustomed to making remarks like, "Don't you think it's exactly your father?" The appearance of absurdity in this dream might, of course, have been easily avoided. If it were permissible to form an opinion on the strength of a single case, one might be tempted to say that this semblance of absurdity is admitted or even desired. 2. Here is another example of the same kind from my own dreams. I lost my father in the year 1896. After his death, my father has played a part in the political life of the Magyars, and has united them into a political whole. And here I see, indistinctly, a little picture, a number of men, as though in the Reichstag. A man is standing on one or two chairs, there are others round about him. I remember that on his deathbed he looked so like Garibaldi, and I am glad that this promise has really come true. Certainly this is absurd enough. It was dreamed at the time when the Hungarians were in a state of anarchy, owing to parliamentary obstruction, and were passing through the crisis from which Colomonzel subsequently delivered them. The trivial circumstance that the scenes beheld in dreams consist of such little pictures is not without significance for the elucidation of this element. The customary visual dream representations of our thoughts present images that impress us as being life-size. My dream picture, however, is the reproduction of a woodcut inserted in the text of an illustrated history of Austria, representing Maria Theresa in the Reichstag of Pressburg, the famous scene of Moriamur pro rege nostro. Like Maria Theresa, my father, in my dream, is surrounded by the multitude, but he is standing on one or two chairs, Stühlen, and is thus like a Stuhlrichter, presiding judge. He has united them. Here the intermediary is the phrase, "We shall need no judge." Those of us who stood about my father's deathbed did actually notice that he looked very like Garibaldi. He had a post-mortem rise of temperature, his cheeks shone redder and redder. Involuntarily we continue, and behind him, in unsubstantial radiance, lay that which subdues us all, the common fate. This uplifting of our thoughts prepares us for the fact that we shall have to deal with this common fate. The post-mortem rise in temperature corresponds to the words after his death in the dream content. The most agonizing of his afflictions had been a complete paralysis of the intestines, obstruction, during the last few weeks of his life. All sorts of disrespectful thoughts associate themselves with this. One of my contemporaries, who lost his father while still at the gymnasium, upon which occasion I was profoundly moved and tendered him my friendship, once told me derisively of the distress of a relative whose father had died in the street and had been brought home, when it appeared, upon undressing the corpse, that at the moment of death, or post mortem, an evacuation of the bowels, Stuhlentleerung, had taken place. The daughter was deeply distressed by this circumstance, because this ugly detail would inevitably spoil her memory of her father. We have now penetrated to the wish that is embodied in this dream, to stand after one's death before one's children, great and undefiled. Who would not wish that? What now has become of the absurdity of this dream? The appearance of absurdity was due only to the fact that a perfectly permissible figure of speech, in which we are accustomed to ignore any absurdity that may exist as between its components, has been faithfully represented in the dream. Here, again, we can hardly deny that the appearance of absurdity is desired and has been purposely produced. The frequency with which dead persons appear in our dreams as living and active and associating with us has evoked undue astonishment and some curious explanations which afford conspicuous proof of our misunderstanding of dreams. And yet the explanation of these dreams is close at hand. How often it happens that we say to ourselves, "If my father were still alive, what would he say to this?" The dream can express this, if in no other way than by his presence in a definite situation. Thus, for instance, a young man whose grandfather has left him a great inheritance dreams that the old man is alive, and calls his grandson to account, reproaching him for his lavish expenditure. What we regard as an objection to the dream, on account of our better knowledge that the man is already dead, is in reality the consoling thought that the dead man does not need to learn the truth, or satisfaction over the fact that he can no longer have a say in the matter. Another form of absurdity found in dreams of deceased relatives does not express scorn and derision. It serves to express the extremest repudiation, the representation of a suppressed thought which one would like to believe the very last thing one would think of. Dreams of this kind appear to be capable of solution only if we remember that a dream makes no distinction between desire and reality. For example, a man who nursed his father during his last illness, and who felt his death very keenly, dreamed some time afterwards the following senseless dream. His father was again living, and conversing with him as usual, but, and this was the remarkable thing, he had nevertheless died, though he did not know it. This dream is intelligible if, after he had nevertheless died, we insert in consequence of the dreamer's wish, and if after but he did not know it, we add that the dreamer had entertained this wish. While nursing him, the son had often wished that his father was dead. That is, that he had had the really compassionate thought that it would be a good thing if death would at last put an end to his sufferings. While he was mourning his father's death, even this compassionate wish became an unconscious reproach, as though it had really contributed to shorten the sick man's life. By the awakening of the earliest infantile feelings against his father, it became possible to express this reproach as a dream, and it was precisely because of the extreme antithesis between the dream instigator and the day thoughts that this dream had to assume so absurd a form. As a general thing, the dreams of a deceased person of whom the dreamer has been fond confront the interpreter with difficult problems, the solution of which is not always satisfying. The reason for this may be sought in the especially pronounced ambivalence of feeling which controls the relation of the dreamer to the dead person. In such dreams, it is quite usual for the deceased person to be treated at first as living. Then it suddenly appears that he is dead, and in the continuation of the dream he is once more living. This has a confusing effect. I at last divined that this alternation of death and life is intended to represent the indifference of the dreamer. It is all one to me whether he is alive or dead. This indifference, of course, is not real, but wished. Its purpose is to help the dreamer to deny his very intense and often contradictory emotional attitudes, and so it becomes the dream representation of his ambivalence. For other dreams in which one meets with deceased persons, the following rule will often be a guide. If in the dream the dreamer is not reminded that the dead person is dead, he sets himself on a par with the dead, he dreams of his own death. The sudden realization or astonishment in the dream, but he has long been dead, is a protest against this identification and rejects the meaning that the dreamer is dead. But I will admit that I feel that dream interpretation is far from having elicited all the secrets of dreams having this content. 3. In the example which I shall now cite, I can detect the dream work in the act of purposely manufacturing an absurdity for which there is no occasion whatever in the dream material. It is taken from the dream which I had as a result of meeting Count Thun just before going away on a holiday. I am driving in a cab, and I tell the driver to drive to a railway station. Of course, I can't drive with you on the railway track itself, I say, after the driver had reproached me as though I had worn him out. At the same time, it seems as though I had already made with him a journey that one usually makes by train. Of this confused and senseless story, analysis gives the following explanation. During the day, I had hired a cab to take me to a remote street in Dornbach. The driver, however, did not know the way, and simply kept on driving, in the manner of such worthy people, until I became aware of the fact and showed him the way, indulging in a few derisive remarks. From this driver, a train of thought led to the aristocratic personage whom I was to meet later on. For the present, I will only remark that one thing that strikes us middle-class plebeians about the aristocracy is that they like to put themselves in the driver's seat. Does not Count Thun guide the Austrian car of state? The next sentence in the dream, however, refers to my brother, whom I thus also identify with the cab driver. I had refused to go to Italy with him this year. Of course I can't drive with you on the railway track itself. And this refusal was a sort of punishment for his accustomed complaint that I usually wear him out on this tour. This finds its way into the dream unchanged. By rushing him too quickly from place to place, and making him see too many beautiful things in a single day. That evening my brother had accompanied me to the railway station, but shortly before the carriage had reached the western station of the Metropolitan Railway, he had jumped out in order to take the train to Purkersdorf. I suggested to him that he might remain with me a little longer, as he did not travel to Purkersdorf by the Metropolitan, but by the Western Railway. This is why, in my dream, I made in the cab a journey which one usually makes by train. In reality, however, it was the other way about. What I told my brother was, the distance which you travel on the Metropolitan Railway you could travel in my company on the Western Railway. The whole confusion of the dream is therefore due to the fact that in my dream I replace Metropolitan Railway by cab, which, to be sure, does good service in bringing the driver and my brother into conjunction. I then elicit from the dream some nonsense which is hardly disentangled by elucidation, and which almost constitutes a contradiction of my earlier speech. Of course, I cannot drive with you on the railway track itself. But as I have no excuse whatever for confronting the Metropolitan Railway with the cab, I must intentionally have given the whole enigmatical story this peculiar form in my dream. But with what intention? We shall now learn what the absurdity in the dream signifies, and the motives which admitted it or created it. In this case, the solution of the mystery is as follows. In the dream I need an absurdity, and something incomprehensible in connection with driving. Fahren equals riding, driving. Because in the dream thoughts I have a certain opinion that demands representation. One evening, at the house of the witty and hospitable lady who appears in another scene of the same dream, as the housekeeper, I heard two riddles which I could not solve. As they were known to the other members of the party, I presented a somewhat ludicrous figure in my unsuccessful attempts to find the solutions. They were two puns turning on the words nachkommen, to obey orders, offspring, and Vorfahren, to drive, forefathers, ancestry. They ran, I believe, as follows. The coachman does it at the master's behests. Every one has it, in the grave it rests. Vorfahren. A confusing detail was that the first halves of the two riddles were identical. The coachman does it at the master's behests. Not every one has it, in the cradle it rests. Nachkommen. When I saw Count Thun drive up, Vorfahren, in state, and fell into the Figaro-like mood, in which one finds that the sole merit of such aristocratic gentlemen is that they have taken the trouble to be born, to become Nachkommen. These two riddles became intermediary thoughts for the dream work. As aristocrats may readily be replaced by coachmen, and since it was once the custom to call a coachman Herr Schwager, the work of condensation could involve my brother in the same representation. But the dream thought at work in the background is as follows. It is nonsense to be proud of one's ancestors. I would rather be an ancestor myself. On account of this opinion, it is nonsense. We have the nonsense in the dream. And now the last riddle in this obscure passage of the dream is solved, namely, that I have driven before with this driver. Thus, a dream is made absurd if there occurs in the dream thoughts, as one of the elements of the contents, the opinion, that is nonsense, and, in general, if criticism and derision are the motives of one of the dreamer's unconscious trains of thought. Hence, absurdity is one of the means by which the dream work represents contradiction. Another means is the inversion of material relation between the dream thoughts and the dream content. Another is the employment of the feeling of motor inhibition. But the absurdity of a dream is not to be translated by a simple no. It is intended to reproduce the tendency of the dream thoughts to express laughter or derision simultaneously with the contradiction. Only with this intention does the dream work produce anything ridiculous. Here again it transforms a part of the latent content into a manifest form. As a matter of fact, we have already cited a convincing example of this significance of an absurd dream. The dream, interpreted without analysis, of the Wagnerian performance which lasted until 7:45 a.m., and in which the orchestra is conducted from a tower, etc., is obviously saying, it is a crazy world and an insane society. He who deserves a thing doesn't get it, and he who doesn't care for it does get it. In this way, the dreamer compares her fate with that of her cousin. The fact that dreams of a dead father were the first to furnish us with examples of absurdity in dreams is by no means accidental. The conditions for the creation of absurd dreams are here grouped together in a typical fashion. The authority proper to the father has at an early age evoked the criticism of the child, and the strict demands which he has made have caused the child, in self-defense, to pay particularly close attention to every weakness of his father's, but the piety with which the father's personality is surrounded in our thoughts, especially after his death, intensifies the censorship which prevents the expression of this criticism from becoming conscious. 4. Here is another absurd dream of a deceased father. I receive a communication from the town council of my native city concerning the cost of accommodation in the hospital in the year 1851. This was necessitated by a seizure from which I was suffering. I make fun of the matter, for, in the first place, I was not yet born in 1851, and in the second place, my father, to whom the communication might refer, is already dead. I go to him in the adjoining room, where he is lying in bed, and tell him about it. To my surprise, he remembers that in the year 1851 he was once drunk and had to be locked up or confined. It was when he was working for the firm of T. Then you, too, used to drink, I ask. You married soon after? I reckon that I was born in 1856, which seems to me to be immediately afterwards. In the light of the foregoing exposition, we shall translate the insistence with which this dream exhibits its absurdities as a sure sign of a particularly embittered and passionate polemic in the dream thoughts. All the greater, then, is our astonishment when we perceive that in this dream the polemic is waged openly, and that my father is denoted as the person who is made a laughing-stock. Such frankness seems to contradict our assumption of a censorship controlling the dream work. The explanation is that here the father is only an interposed figure, while the quarrel is really with another person, who appears in the dream only in a single allusion. Whereas a dream usually treats of revolt against other persons, behind whom the father is concealed, here it is the other way about. The father serves as the man of straw to represent another, and hence the dream dares to concern itself openly with a person who is usually hallowed, because there is present the certain knowledge that he is not in reality intended. We learn of this condition of affairs by considering the occasion of the dream. It was dreamed after I had heard that an older colleague, whose judgment was considered infallible, had expressed disapproval and astonishment on hearing that one of my patients had already been undergoing psychoanalytic treatment at my hands for 5 years. The introductory sentences of the dream allude in a transparently disguised manner to the fact that this colleague had for a time taken over the duties which my father could no longer perform: statement of expenses, accommodation in the hospital. And when our friendly relations began to alter for the worse, I was thrown into the same emotional conflict as that which arises in the case of a misunderstanding between father and son, by reason of the part played by the father and his earlier functions. The dream thoughts now bitterly resent the reproach that I am not making better progress, which extends itself from the treatment of this patient to other things. Does my colleague know anyone who can get on any faster? Does he not know that conditions of this sort are usually incurable and last for life? What are 4 or 5 years in comparison to a whole lifetime, especially when life has been made so much easier for the patient during the treatment? The impression of absurdity in this dream is brought about largely by the fact that sentences from different divisions of the dream thoughts are strung together without any reconciling transition. Thus the sentence, "I go to him in the adjoining room," etc., leaves the subject from which the preceding sentences are taken, and faithfully reproduces the circumstances under which I told my father that I was engaged to be married. Thus the dream is trying to remind me of the noble disinterestedness which the old man showed at that time, and to contrast this with the conduct of another newly introduced person. I now perceive that the dream is allowed to make fun of my father, because in the dream thoughts, in the full recognition of his merits, he is held up as an example to others. It is in the nature of every censorship that one is permitted to tell untruths about forbidden things rather than the truth. The next sentence, to the effect that my father remembers that he was once drunk, and was locked up in consequence, contains nothing that really relates to my father any more. The person who is screened by him is here a no less important personage than the great Meinert, in whose footsteps I followed with such veneration, and whose attitude towards me, after a short period of favoritism, changed into one of undisguised hostility. The dream recalls to me his own statement that in his youth he had at one time formed the habit of intoxicating himself with chloroform, with the result that he had to enter a sanatorium, and also my second experience with him shortly before his death. I had an embittered literary controversy with him in reference to masculine hysteria, the existence of which he denied; and when I visited him during his last illness and asked him how he felt, he described his condition at some length, and concluded with the words, "You know, I have always been one of the prettiest cases of masculine hysteria." Thus to my satisfaction and to my astonishment, he admitted what he so long and so stubbornly denied. But the fact that in this scene of my dream I can use my father to screen Meinert is explained not by any discovered analogy between the two persons, but by the fact that it is the brief yet perfectly adequate representation of a conditional sentence in the dream thoughts, which, if fully expanded, would read as follows. Of course, if I belonged to the second generation, if I were the son of a professor or a privy councillor, I should have progressed more rapidly. In my dream, I make my father a professor and a privy councillor. The most obvious and most annoying absurdity of the dream lies in the treatment of the date 1851, which seems to me to be indistinguishable from 1856, as though a difference of 5 years meant nothing whatever. But it is just this one of the dream thoughts that requires expression. 4 or 5 years, that is precisely the length of time during which I enjoyed the support of the colleague mentioned at the outset. But it is also the duration of time I kept my fiancée waiting before I married her. And by a coincidence that is eagerly exploited by the dream thoughts, it is also the time I have kept my oldest patient waiting for a complete cure. What are 5 years? Ask the dream thoughts. That is no time at all to me, that isn't worth consideration. I have time enough ahead of me, and just as what you wouldn't believe came true at last, so I shall accomplish this also. Moreover, the number 51, when considered apart from the number of the century, is determined in yet another manner and in an opposite sense, for which reason it occurs several times over in the dream. It is the age at which man seems particularly exposed to danger, the age at which I have seen colleagues die suddenly, among them one who had been appointed a few days earlier to a professorship for which he had long been waiting. 5. Another absurd dream which plays with figures. An acquaintance of mine, Herr M., has been attacked in an essay by no less a person than Goethe, and, as we all think, with unjustifiable vehemence. Herr M. is, of course, crushed by this attack. He complains of it bitterly at a dinner party. But his veneration for Goethe has not suffered as a result of this personal experience. I try to elucidate the temporal relations a little, as they seem improbable to me. Goethe died in 1832. Since his attack upon M must, of course, have taken place earlier, M was at the time quite a young man. It seems plausible to me that he was 18 years old, but I do not know exactly what the date of the present year is, and so the whole calculation lapses into obscurity. The attack, by the way, is contained in Goethe's well-known essay on Nature. We shall soon find the means of justifying the nonsense of this dream. Herr M., with whom I became acquainted at a dinner party, had recently asked me to examine his brother, who showed signs of general paralysis. The conjecture was right. The painful thing about this visit was that the patient gave his brother away by alluding to his youthful pranks, though our conversation gave him no occasion to do so. I had asked the patient to tell me the year of his birth, and had repeatedly got him to make trifling calculations in order to show the weakness of his memory, which tests, by the way, he passed quite well. Now I can see that I behave like a paralytic in the dream. I do not know exactly what the date of the present year is. Other material of the dream is drawn from another recent source. The editor of a medical periodical, a friend of mine, had accepted for his paper a very unfavorable, crushing review of the last book of my Berlin friend, F.L., the critic being a very youthful reviewer who was not very competent to pass judgment. I thought I had a right to interfere, and called the editor to account. He greatly regretted his acceptance of the review, but he would not promise any redress. I thereupon broke off my relations with the periodical, and in my letter of resignation I expressed the hope that our personal relations would not suffer as a result of the incident. The third source of this dream is an account given by a female patient, it was fresh in my memory at the time, of the psychosis of her brother, who had fallen into a frenzy crying, "Nature, nature." The physicians in attendance thought that the cry was derived from a reading of Goethe's beautiful essay, and that it pointed to the patient's overwork in the study of natural philosophy. I thought rather of the sexual meaning in which even our less cultured people use the word nature, and the fact that the unfortunate man afterwards mutilated his genitals seems to show that I was not far wrong. 18 years was the age of this patient at the time of this access of frenzy. If I add further that the book of my so severely criticized friend, one asks oneself whether the author or oneself is crazy, had been the opinion of another critic, treats of the temporal conditions of life, and refers the duration of Goethe's life to the multiple of a number significant from the biological point of view, it will readily be admitted that in my dream I am putting myself in my friend's place. I try to elucidate the temporal relations a little. But I behave like a paretic, and the dream revels in absurdity. This means that the dream thoughts say, ironically, naturally he is the fool, the lunatic, and you are the clever people who know better. Perhaps, however, it is the other way about? Now, the other way about is abundantly represented in my dream, inasmuch as Goethe has attacked the young man, which is absurd, while it is perfectly possible, even today, for a young fellow to attack the immortal Goethe, and inasmuch as I reckon from the year of Goethe's death, while I made the paretic reckon from the year of his birth. But I have further promised to show that no dream is inspired by other than egoistical motives. Accordingly, I must account for the fact that in this dream I make my friend's cause my own, and put myself in his place. My critical conviction in waking life would not justify my doing so. Now, the story of the 18-year-old patient and the divergent interpretations of his cry, "Nature," allude to the fact that I have put myself into opposition to the majority of physicians by claiming a sexual etiology for the psychoneuroses. I may say to myself, you will meet with the same kind of criticism as your friend. Indeed, you have already done so to some extent. So that I may now replace the he in the dream thoughts by we. Yes, you are right, we too are the fools. That mea res agitur is clearly shown by the mention of the short, incomparably beautiful essay of Goethe's, for it was a popular lecture on this essay which induced me to study the natural sciences when I left the gymnasium, and was still undecided as to my future. Section 35.